Cool. Okay, well, we're continuing our series, which we're calling Two Ways to Live, looking at what are the foundations of the gospel, what are the basics of the gospel, both in terms of doing ourselves good as a refresher and also in terms of how would we share this with somebody else who was to ask us. And so I'm just continuing with week 2. We'll do a little reminder in a second. But I want to start off with a passage from a book. I wonder if you can tell me what book this is from. It should be fairly obvious from the figures, I think. Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman and the clerk and the undertaker and the chief mourner. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. A Christmas Carol. Brilliant. Okay. I had to go and look it up because the version I know is from the Muppet Christmas Carol, which is slightly different. One of the best films ever made. But so this is A Christmas Carol. I wanted to share that passage at the beginning. I'll come to it in just a second. But to explain why I want to go there, I want to tell you a story about me. I had a summer job when I was about 20, working at The Perch, which is a pub just on the far side of Port Meadow from here. And I worked there all through a couple of summers. And The Perch, because it's set back a bit from the river, it doesn't get all of the tourist traffic. And so there were a couple of graveyard shifts a day, in particular the one around lunchtime. Just no one came. No one came at all, but they had to have somebody on the bar. And so you'd be good conversation time. And I had a chap there who I was working alongside for a few weeks. And you know, he was he had the long hair and dreads, and he was quite into exploring Buddhism and New Age stuff. And, you know, it was a bit of a stereotype, actually, in some ways. Bar job, had the hairstyle, all the things. And we got chatting. I don't even quite know to this day how we got onto it, but we got chatting about worldviews. And he told me a bit about his. And then he asked me mine. And I started with God Made the World. I wasn't working with Tim's Two Ways to Live illustration. I didn't actually know this one at the time. But I thought, well, I'll start with that. And so I explained about how, God had made the world. And then I got on to how we'd screwed it up and we now lived in a fallen world. And then a couple of people came into the pub. And so we had to pause and we had to serve them. And then when we'd finished serving them, the guy looked at his watch and he said, I've got to go now. And his parting shot before he disappeared, and actually turned out to be his last shift and I never saw him again, was, that's a pretty depressing situation, isn't it? And I thought, oh, well, I stuffed that one up, didn't I? I'd spent so long getting to the bad news, and that's all I'd given him. Now, I trust that God leads people, and God is able to bring him to somebody who can give him the good news. But I was left thinking, I didn't really do that right, did I? And that's why I wanted to read this passage from Dickens at the beginning, because Charles Dickens does something at the beginning, doesn't he? He sets a scene. He needs to set a scene in which he introduces Marley as dead and Scrooge as this cold, miserly curmudgeon, and yet he does it in such an engaging way that you want to hear what comes next. And he also hints, doesn't he, at something wonderful to come. He says, this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. And so you hear, and actually he goes on, it's a long, a long passage about how horrible Scrooge is, essentially. And you get this interaction with him, with his uncle and with his clerk, and you see just the depth of unpleasantness of his character, but there's something wonderful coming. And you still need that negative context in order to make sense of it. So today, we're going to be looking at an uncomfortable but necessary truth about the gospel. It's the bad news. But I do want to say, as we look at this, we know, and we need to remind ourselves, there is good news that comes after this. And as we think about how we might explain this to somebody who isn't a believer, we need to think, how do we say it in such a way that we don't just leave them with the bad news? we need to point it ahead to the good. And we'll look a little bit as we go along at how we do that. We'll be looking at Jesus, not Charles Dickens, for that, just to reassure you. Although I think we could learn from Dickens in this particular regard. I also just want to underline something that Tim said last week about the purpose for this series. I put it down in 3 Fs. This is about foundations for us. We are supposed to move on beyond the basics of the gospel, as the book of Hebrews says, and get on from milk to solid food. But at the same time, it's good to come back every now and again and say, what is the groundwork? What are the basics of the gospel? What is the core of what we believe? And so it's really good for us just to go back to those foundations from time to time and to look at them again. The second one is about fluency, and we talked, didn't we, about when you get that opportunity, and who knows when it might come, but somebody just asks that question, or there's that vulnerable moment with a friend or a relative where they're seeking. Are we ready? Are we fluent so that we can explain something clearly and winsomely? And the last one is about freedom. And by that, I mean, this is not about guilt. And I want to just make this point again, as Tim did. I was thinking, I enjoy cooking, but I'm a mediocre cook at best. Part of the reason for that is that I'm slow and I leave the kitchen a mess, which means that, generally speaking, it has been a blessing over the last 15-ish years, very early on in marriage, for me not to cook and for Caroline to cook, because she does it better, more efficiently, and we spend much less time trying to bring the kitchen back to order afterwards. Now, if somebody was to say to me, listen, I'd love to give you 6 weeks of just some basic cookery skills that give you confidence, because the other thing is, like, if Caroline has left a meal out ready to go, even if I've got the extra time, I don't normally go, I'll cook this because I've got the extra time, because I'm not confident I'll do it as well as she would. If somebody said, I'll give you 6 lessons on basics of cookery and how to, clear up as you go and all this kind of thing, one thing I could do is I could feel guilt. I could be like, you're probably saying this because I don't cook enough and I'm not pulling my weight in the marriage. But that's not what's been offered. What's been offered is, here's something that will equip you and bless you so you can take opportunities. I want to say the same's true here. This is not saying, look, you, and you. I haven't heard any stories of you sharing faith, and this is trying to make sure that you do. It's not the heart here at all. The heart is, when those opportunities come up, do you feel like it can be something that comes out fluently and freely? Because there are people who desperately want to know about Jesus. There's a Talking Jesus survey done every few years. There was one back in 2015. They've just finished another one, and I saw the launch meeting on Thursday. So I only know some stats. But these stats that I have seen, back in 2015, for every person who answered the survey who wasn't a Christian but had spoken to a Christian in the last year or two about faith, 1 in 5 really, really wanted to know more. 3 in 5 were like, it was positive, but I'm good. 1 in 5 was like, it was a bit awkward. 1 in 5 was like, I really want to know more about this. I'm just waiting for them to bring it up again because I don't know how to. This latest survey, it's 1 in 3. 1 in 3 people who've talked to a Christian about faith but haven't decided to become a Christian still want to know more. So those people are out there, and it's just serving them well if we're ready to share. And it gets to be a joy for us. I love talking about Jesus because he is everything to me. I enjoy my hobbies. I enjoy being married and having kids. I enjoy, nature around me. But Jesus is the core of my joy, and I believe he's the core of our joy. And I love talking about him. And if I can do anything to be more fluent in that, it's freedom and it's joy for me. And I hope it will be for you. Good. Okay, enough about that, I think. Let's just do a quick recap, because if we do this every week, then it'll get embedded. So, Tim, would you mind firing up that PowerPoint, please? And we'll just do them a picture at a time. So, this particular way of looking at the gospel, and as Tim said, it's not the only one at all. It doesn't fit all the boxes, and in particular, it doesn't have very much about the Holy Spirit. I thought that was a useful thing to point out, Tim. But it is a really, really good picture of the gospel. Starts off with God's creating the world to live, and creating us to live under his good and loving rule. And you can show it with, if you just click that, Tim. Great. You can show it with a picture of the world. We're on top of the world because we're given stewardship of the world, but God is our king. The second picture then is that we reject that kingship. And you can demonstrate that by crossing out the crown, and the man stands off to the side with his own little crown on. We want to be our own rulers. The consequences of that, the third panel, are that we're subject to death. The fourth panel, thankfully, God sends Jesus because he loves us so much. God sends his son Jesus into the world to die in our place and to bring forgiveness. Doesn't end there. Panel 5, Jesus conquers death. Jesus does everything that we could not, and he gives new life. And he will come back again, and we'll be breaking bread later on. And one of the things we do when we break bread is we remind ourselves, Jesus is coming again. And then it ends with a choice. What are you going to do about it? So today we're going to be on panel 2. Next week we're on panel 3, and these are the necessary bad news. but we will get on to the good as well. Wonderful. Bless you. The last thing to say is we will have time for Q&A. I think I've left enough space in here. I'm on track. So if you've got questions as we go along, just note them down, and we'll have some time to ask them towards the end. So there's some interactivity in this. Good. Okay. So panel 2, we reject God's good, loving rule, and we want ourselves to be king. This is laid out particularly strongly in Genesis 3. That's the narrative of when it first happens, although it is an ongoing thing. But I have to say, if I was talking to somebody who wasn't a Christian, I probably wouldn't start in Genesis 3, because there's all kinds of extra things that take more unpacking. You know, people get hung up on whether Adam and Eve were literal people. People want to know why eating from a tree is wrong. There's good answers to those things, but it's just not where I would start. So we will look at Genesis 3, but I'm saying that because this is also for us and our foundations. And later on, we'll get on to, if I was talking to somebody who wanted to know more, where would I go in the scriptures to help them with that? Okay, Genesis 3. It's important that we understand what's going on here. I left my Bible over there, which is not helpful. Okay, in the middle of the garden, we've got 2 trees, which are the tree of... Okay, I'm going to be specific about this because it matters. It's not the tree of good and evil, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, absolutely. And the other one, somebody said here, the tree of life. Brilliant, okay. So what is this tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Any volunteers? Like, what is it? What is this knowledge of good and evil that it's talking about? Our understanding of morality. I think that's a brilliant answer. Yeah, absolutely. Our understanding of morality, and possibly something that is even more than just our understanding of it. I think it's also about our defining of it. Sorry, somebody said something just as I said that. Yeah, so it's obedience versus independence, isn't it? It's who defines what's good and what's evil. We actually have some really helpful pointers in this, because there's a couple of other places in the Old Testament where those same words for knowledge, good, and evil appear together, and they kind of help us understand a bit what this is about. One is when Moses is talking to the Israelites just as they're about to go into the promised land, and he says this: "The little ones that you said would be taken captive, your children who do not yet know good from bad," those are exactly the same 3 words, so that could be know, good, and evil, "they will enter the land, I will give it to them." So there's something here about sort of a moral maturity as well, isn't there? And the same again, same 3 words come up in the Isaiah prophecy about Jesus, the virgin will be with child. Before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. Again, in Hebrew, those are the same 3 words: know, good, evil. Before there's that sense of maturity and decision-making, the land of the 2 kings you dread will be laid waste. So there's something here where this tree, God says, look, don't go there. Don't seek moral independence. Don't seek to outgrow my definition of good and evil. And we failed. We failed big time. Okay, so what is this tree? I think we've got an idea. It's about moral maturity and independence from God. The other question that often comes up here is, so did God set us up for failure? Why did God put the tree there in the first place? Any volunteers for that? I think there's plenty of answers for this that all overlap. But yeah, far away. Free will. Okay, yeah, absolutely key. Free will. Yes. You know, I love, well, I'm going to say it anyway, and then I'll explain why I'm hesitant about saying it. I love it when my kids are obedient. Now, what comes to mind when you hear that? Does it sound controlling? Because it could be, couldn't it? Actually, I hate it when my kids or anybody else's are slavishly obedient, either because they're afraid or because they've just given up disagreeing or something like that. That's no way to be, is it? And actually, I hate it when I see little bits of that in my parenting sometimes. And, you know, sometimes you'll walk around the supermarket and you see somebody who's just shouting at their kids and their kids are just cowed into obedience. You're like, oh, no, that's not how we want to be. But what I love is when I see my kids go, oh, do you know what? Because I love you, I'll do it. Or because I trust you, I'll trust your judgment here. That's the kind of obedience God wants for us. But it requires that freedom that you're talking about, Thomas. Absolutely. It requires us to have a legitimate choice. Where people say, has God set us up for failure? I want to say emphatically no. What happens is he's entrusted us with something amazing. Actually, in Genesis 2, first of all, he blesses. He blesses us to be fruitful and increase. And that's an active blessing. And then he gives us responsibility. He says, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the animal kingdom. Tame nature. And along with that, along with all that blessing and responsibility, comes a constraint. Leave it to me to define good and evil. And I think if we say God set us up for failure, it's a bit like my in-laws gave me a planer, one of these things used for flattening planks of wood, for my birthday. Now, if I was to go back to Liz and Darryl and say, can't believe you gave me this planer, I've taken my finger off. Do you see what I mean? They've given me something that's powerful and good. With it comes the potential for using it badly. But that's not their fault. They've given me something which has been a blessing and a help and a tool. I can abuse it, but that's not their fault. And in the same way, God has not set us up for failure. He's set us up for blessing and for responsibility. And he wants us to live in that. Okay, this theme doesn't just stick there in Genesis. It actually runs through the rest of the Old Testament. It's not a one-off rebellion, and we all just are tainted by association. There's this theme. It follows through. Because of Adam's sin, it's corrupted the human race, and it continues and continues and continues. You see it in Cain. Am I my brother's keeper? In other words, God, how dare you tell me what I should do? It's up to me to decide that. Babel, let's ignore God's mandate to fill the earth. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's make ourselves great. And then you get this whole mess with Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau, and who should get the blessing, and all this tussling. And then Laban comes in, and you get his deception, and everybody wants to make their own ideas of what's true and false and right and wrong. Or Pharaoh, who's this God that I should listen to him? I'm king and God. It's pretty stark, isn't it? Israel in the wilderness. God may have delivered us, but you know what? I bet he's delivered us to die in the wilderness. We'd rather have our own leaders and go back to Egypt. We've got the Canaanites. We looked at this when we were looking at Abraham. The Canaanites had just steeped themselves in the rejection of God and the worship of just detestable to-gods for so long that their culture was so wicked that God was like, this is not rescuable. The only way to remove the child sacrifice and the horrors of some of what they did is to just totally destroy the culture. Then we've got the book of Judges, and this is particularly telling. The phrase comes up twice in the book of Judges, chapter 17, chapter 21. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And post-exile, it's no better. They return, but even then the prophets are always just saying, look, return to God. Return to God. Don't do your own thing. Return to God. So all through the Old Testament, you get this. And then this theme of everyone doing what's right in their own eyes also continues in the book of Romans in the New Testament. This passage from Romans 1 is pretty clear. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. This is Romans 1:18 if you want to follow on. It's up to you. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God's made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what's been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human, and birds and animals and reptiles. Romans is really clear, Paul is really clear to point out this is not just an ignorance that's crept into the human race. This is an active choice. It's an active choice that we do not want what we see of the knowledge of God, and so we reject it, and we would rather choose things of our own making, the God in our own image. We choose folly over wisdom. I say we, obviously, thankfully, Jesus Christ has redeemed that in those who accept it. And so that can be reversed, but that is the state of humanity. Now, I said along the way, we do want to make sure we notice the good news. One of the great bits of good news here is this is a great leveller. I want you to imagine a group of friends going out for a walk, and they see a sign saying, dangerous property, do not enter. It's a shortcut. They think they'll nip across it, and they fall down a mine shaft, okay? Whole bunch of friends down at the bottom of the mine shaft, far, far, far too high up to get out. Various degrees of injuries. Okay, and one of them steps up on a little rock that's about a foot tall, looks down at the other ones and says, I'm closer to getting out than you are. That's what it's like when we look at another person and say, I'm more righteous than you. It's like we all fall not just a little bit short, but so far short. Can you imagine the rescuer lowering down the rope to get somebody out and the person on the rock saying, well, I'm higher up than you, it should be me first. And it's ludicrous, isn't it? Nobody deserves to be rescued. Everybody has the offer. That's the great leveller of the gospel. All fall short, and so far short, but all are given the lifeline. Jesus died for everyone who will accept it. You probably want to have a think about what would be your way of explaining that. Feel free to use that one, but something which works for you. Because sometimes a story makes something clear in a way that just saying it in words doesn't. Jesus did this all the time. So I mentioned that this theme of rebellion continues in Romans, but again, Romans is written to the church. It's written to people who've already put their trust in Jesus. So where would you go with people who haven't put their trust in Jesus? Well, let's ask Jesus. Jesus spoke to the people around him, many of whom were not his disciples. Yes, they were God-fearers. Yes, they were devout Jews, many of them, although many of them were not devout, tax collectors and sinners, as the phrase goes, as well as Pharisees. And he tells 3 parables about lost things. He starts with the lost coin and the lost sheep, and then it's the lost son. Now, rebellion features, doesn't it? Let's think about the lost son in particular. Jesus sets up this rebellious second son. There's a father with 2 sons. The younger son says, give me my share of the inheritance, and off he goes to a far-off land. He sets up this story with rebellion there. But because it's a story, it draws people in. They see there's more to it than just the bad news. And he draws people in. And what do they see? Well, they see that as soon as the son realizes the depths of despair that he's got himself into, as soon as he turns back, he sees the father waiting at the house, watching for his son. And he sees the father embracing the son and putting a cloak over his shoulders and a ring on his fingers. And so he doesn't just give you the bad news, but he draws you into the good at the same time. You need to say the rebellion bit, it matters. Otherwise the rest doesn't make sense. You think back to Charles Dickens, nothing wondrous can come of what I'm going to tell you unless you get that Marley was dead. It's the same here. Nothing wonderful can come of us realizing God's death for us unless we get the depths of our rebellion. But don't leave it there. Draw in the story so that people see that there's good news off the back of it. The Father has got open arms. How would you relate this to today? People sometimes want, the Bible can feel quite distant to people sometimes. It's not something they've necessarily read. More and more it's not. So what can you look at in today's culture? This thing of doing what's right in our own eyes, I think is just prevalent everywhere in society. I think it always has been, but it's very easy to pick out examples from today. I mentioned on Palm Sunday a sort of international example. One nation's freedom fighter is another nation's terrorist. Britain and the US launched what many see as an illegal invasion of Iraq, and Russia's launched what many see as an illegal invasion of Ukraine. Now, I see a difference, but other people don't. There's this thing I mentioned with the Security Council, where technically Russia could be booted off the Security Council because the seat was given to the USSR and not to Russia. But if that was the case, then China would also potentially lose their seat for the same reason. And the UK don't want to go there because if Scotland leaves the UK, then we might also get booted off. So this vested interests, everyone does what's right in their own eyes, not what is objectively right. As soon as you stand up on a soapbox and say, well, you're doing the wrong thing, people can also point at decisions that you've made. And nationally, we see that. I like this one. At home, what's the definition of speeding? I think most people's, including mine, definition of speeding is exceeding the speed limit by more than I do. I'm going to take it that the ripple of amused laughter means that we're all guilty as charged. But it's a thing, isn't it? You know, I drive at 72 on a motorway, or sometimes 74. And if somebody comes up on my tail doing 85, I go, oh, goodness me. But, you know, I'm over the limit as well. Now, where does that lie? I'm doing what's right in my own eyes. It's also true in our attitude towards God. So we see throughout history God and religion being exploited to legitimize political aims or military aims of individuals or groups. We see it being turned to use for profit, like Scientology, which is a very, very big business, or just being sidelined by laws like it is in France, and to some extent here in the UK, much less so. And right across the Western world, the approach to faith tends to be not what do I actually believe to be true, but what would be comfortable and convenient for me to believe was true. When there's a clash between what a faith teaches and what society does, we don't go, now which is true and which is false? We say, is it acceptable for that religion to be true? That's the question that gets asked. In other words, crown's on my head, I decide, or perhaps collectively we decide whether or not this is okay. Taking from the tree again, defining good and evil for ourselves. The crown is very, very firmly on our head. It's quite easy to demonstrate that to people. And I think it's really helpful for people to see that, because then, off the back of that, the good news becomes so much better. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second and just ask if there's been any questions or things that you want to sort of query or challenge in what I've said so far, because if there is, it would be good just to have a chance to talk about them. We've got 10 minutes set aside for this, so there's plenty of time. So, as I've been talking, have you thought at all, not so sure about that, or what would you say if somebody asked this? Any questions like that that people would like to throw in? We'll go Sarah and then Samuel. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, totally. So some people don't believe that God created the world. Absolutely true. And actually the Romans passage says that a lot of people will be in that situation. It's not our job to convince people. And I know you know this as well, because we've talked about this a lot, Sarah, but the Holy Spirit is at work in everybody's hearts who will receive him, to whatever extent they'll receive him. For some people, it's very much stay away, and he tends to respect that. For other people, there's some openness. And when we're looking to share Jesus with people, we can only go where the Holy Spirit has already softened hearts and people can receive him. I'm not saying that it's never a good idea to have a conversation and challenge something, but if somebody is so set that God didn't create the world, it may be that at that point in time that person's just closed. It could be, because this is not the only way to explain the gospel, it could be that actually it just means don't start with creation. And for some people it might be about actually them seeing a demonstration of the Holy Spirit's power. That was often one of Paul's things, wasn't he? He said, I don't always come, in fact I don't come with persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. And I know, Sarah, you and others are active in praying for people, for instance, for healing or for breakthrough in situations. Sometimes that's what people will need. But there is a lifting off our shoulders. Although it's important, and it's deeply, deeply important, it's not solely on our shoulders. And I think we need to be clear about that. Otherwise, we live under that guilt and compulsion, don't we? Samuel. Great, okay, I'm just going to repeat that in case anyone's listening to this afterwards. So the question about being set up to fail, what would Adam and Eve have known about right and wrong before taking from the tree, and how could they have understood it was wrong if they had no knowledge of good and evil? I will say I think it's complex, so I don't expect my answer to be the be-all and end-all, but I think it's the difference between knowing and deciding for ourselves. So I believe when God says, don't do this, you'll die, do take of the tree of life, I believe that he wouldn't have said that if mankind was not able to understand that. So I think they clearly have an understanding of do, don't do, that's good, that's not good. This idea of the knowledge of good and evil is that sense of moral maturity of I'm going to decide for myself what is good and what's bad, as seen in the fact that I'm going to do something that you said don't do it. So it's not just a head knowledge thing, but it's an independence thing. And I suppose my example would be around about, children and parents. And when you're a very, very young child, you tend to just accept that your parents know what's good and bad. And as you grow up, there's this sort of increasingly stepping back and saying, well, I hear and I respect that. I'm starting to make my own decisions, and I might end up in different places from you. And that's fine and natural with parents. But God's saying, don't do it with me. I define good and evil. I think that's what it's about, as far as I understand it. It is complicated. Yep, absolutely. Tim. Mm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. In fact, actually, there's a chap on the Alpha videos, on the video about resisting evil, and Nicky Gumbel was chatting to this guy, and he'd come along to the whole of the Alpha course and was totally unmoved by it, and it got to the session on resisting evil, and that day he gave his life to the Lord, and he said to Nicky, I realised it was all true. I'm a barrister, like Nicky is. He said, I see evil every day, and I've always thought there's more to it than just people. I've always thought there must be a destructive force of evil. This is connected with me. I realise it's true. And that, of all the ways into faith, you think, surely not. But you're right, there's points of connection, and it's not a sequential thing necessarily. Really, really helpful. Yeah.
You get to a point where we're talking about what's happening in Ukraine or other things going on. And ultimately you end up with no answer. And I found that I need to learn more of what Jesus said.
Mm.
And the minute you say, but Jesus said, right, then you reflect on what you're saying or what you're thinking or what.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things about these is they all come with a scripture, but what does Jesus say to it? Jesus' parable of the lost son is one place I'll often go, but actually there's so much more to it than that. The Talking Jesus survey I mentioned earlier, they do, one of the questions is, for people who've decided to become a Christian, what were the key things that led you to do that? And obviously you can tick more than one, but more than a quarter of the people who came to faith, the primary thing was simply engaging with the scriptures, either reading a Bible or somebody opening the Bible with you and just seeing God's words, undressed up, just God's words, not ours. So yeah, absolutely, really, really important to keep coming back to what did Jesus say? What does Jesus say? Yeah, definitely. I like the Mary Bells Theological Society. Okay, I'm going to pause there then if there's no more questions. If you're doing the 2-minute version of 2 Ways to Live, if you've got an elevator conversation, as it were, you won't go into all that kind of level of detail. And it's probably enough just to say, look, we chose to reject God's good, loving rule and make ourselves our own rulers. Give a contemporary example. But if you're mentioning Bible verses as you go, one really good one, because it's very pictorial, it works for people, is that bit from Isaiah 53. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. And of course, one of the great things about that is it leads on to say, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So if you want to then lead it on into the next bit, you can. But it's just a wonderful picture, isn't it? Each sheep just wandering off in its own direction, away from the shepherd. It works for people, I think. So we're going to pause here for now in terms of rebellion. There will be good news. I've got 2 weeks on bad news, so feel for me. But as we're stopping here, we're now going to remember the second half of that. The Lord's laid on him the iniquity of us all. We're going to pause now. We're going to break bread. And we're going to remember that Jesus bore all of this rebellion on the cross when he submitted perfectly to the Father, where we did not. So, Samuel, would you mind coming up? That would be great, please. Samuel's going to read a passage from Romans 5 to us, and then we'll break bread.